This video will not go into narrative spoilers for Resident Evil Requiem. However, if you haven't played the game and want to do so blind, please be aware that it will discuss gameplay from both playable characters, which unavoidably involves talking about the second half of the game. Actual gameplay spoilers, i.e. mention of bosses and endgame areas, will be preceded with a warning and timestamps. But you still may want to play the game before watching the video for the best experience. Years ago, Resident Evil coined the term survival horror for a genre of video games whose gameplay was defined by resource scarcity, non-linear exploration in a relatively large but closed and maze-like environment, puzzle solving, and backtracking. Our player characters had the means to defend themselves, but not without limits. A small inventory meant that carrying all your guns would prevent you from picking up whatever you needed at your next destination. Avoiding combat and trying to evade enemies risked taking damage and possibly using one of your precious few health items. And saves being limited to set points in the map, and having to use up a limited resource in order to make them, increased the cost for death to potentially hours of lost progress. Over the years, the definition of the genre has on the one hand evolved. Different survival horror games emphasize different aspects of the formula. Some have made the combat tougher. Some have made evasion tougher. Different games have different takes on resource scarcity, whether the inventory should be limited, the use of stealth, melee combat or dodging, and particularly in the current genre renaissance, there are a plethora of great survival horror games that wear their influences on their sleeves, yet still stand tall with their own identity. At the same time, the term survival horror has also been used to describe games far outside its definition. One that I see frequently, as somebody who does challenge runs on the Last of Us series, is those games being described as survival horror, when they're linear stealth action games or third-person shooters, depending on how you look at it. One big reason for this is that Resident Evil itself has, over the years, moved significantly away from survival horror, and a lot of people have viewed them as taking the term with them. The evolution of the series, culminating in the chaotic mess that was Resident Evil 6, and we'll talk more about that later in the video, took us very far from what those who fell in love with the series on the original PlayStation enjoyed about the games. Resident Evil 7 in particular represented a course correction on that front, leaning more towards survival horror, though only really for the parts in the main Baker house and the old house. And of course, this brought us Resident Evil 2 Remake, which, lacking as it may have been in story cohesion across the different character scenarios, was fantastically designed in terms of gameplay. Village was far more linear and action-oriented, but with certain areas like Castle Dimitrescu and Heisenberg's factory giving at least some freedom in exploration, almost a prototype for the RE4 Remake's 3 areas being more interconnected than before and allowing backtracking, albeit optional rather than mandatory, as it blended action with some very strong survival horror elements. The culmination of this, for a series which almost has 2 competing identities, each with their own fans, is Resident Evil 9, Requiem, a game in which survival horror and action horror sit side by side, each represented by their own protagonist. Purely in terms of the games made with the modern RE engine, Leon Kennedy makes perfect sense in this context as an avatar for the series. Having started off his journey in the tight corridors of the Raccoon Police Department, sneaking past lickers and dodging Mr. X while limited in terms of ammunition, but grown into a knife-fighting, Ganado-suplexing action hero. And so here, he represents that catharsis of high-octane action, initially as an interlude between chapters of Grace Ashcroft's slower-paced, stealth and evasion-oriented survival horror gameplay. She's an FBI analyst, so she can use a gun and her brain, but she's also young, without field experience, and thrown into a traumatic situation even before she finds herself face to face with zombies, all of which sets up her gameplay style perfectly. Before we dive into the gameplay though, let's start at the beginning. Requiem is, from the very start, the most grounded and realistic looking Resident Evil game to date. By this, I don't mean the graphics, though this game does of course look absolutely stunning in its environments and textures, complemented by on-point sound design, but the fact that we start off in realistic locations. a functioning FBI field office, a living city, and the dark, empty ruin of a hotel. Even Rhodes Hill, our main location for the first half or so of the game, feels like a real place. This isn't to say that the Baker estate from RE7 or the eponymous village of 8 were unrealistic. More that, despite photorealistic graphics, they still represented places that most players will only have seen through the lens of horror media. The backwoods farm inhabited by chainsaw-wielding maniacs, the superstitious village overshadowed by the vampire's castle, the factory of the modern-day Dr. Frankenstein, and so on. Whereas seeing an FBI analyst go, torch in hand, into a burnt-out crime scene could be a scene from the X-Files, but equally could be a scene from a police procedural. And it has the effect of grounding the game, even as the later aspects still get as fantastical as they can in any Resident Evil story. That story, without mentioning anything other than what has already been shown in trailers, focuses on Grace being sent back to the hotel where her mother, Alyssa Ashcroft from Resident Evil Outbreak, was murdered, to investigate a strange death. One which DSO agent Leon S. Kennedy is also investigating, tied to the mysterious deaths and apparent infection of survivors from the Raccoon City outbreak in 1998. The plot here is intriguing, particularly as we uncover more details and the connections to other entries in the series. Even when they're little more than breadcrumbs, it does come across as the series trying to make its overarching myth arc more cohesive and address its habit of ending games with cliffhangers before shifting focus and not bothering to resolve anything it sets up. This game certainly doesn't try to gather up every loose thread in the series, which is good, because attempts to do that all at once in stories tend to be clumsy and unsatisfying. But it does at least suggest that there's more of a plan, even if a retroactive one, in the storytelling than we might have thought. I'm going to save my thoughts on what this game does for the myth arc of the series for a separate video, which will go into spoilers. What I will say here is that, while it does nothing to undermine the quality of this game or its story, there are problems with how the history of the franchise has been, perhaps not rewritten, but at least refocused, given what actually happens in the original trilogy plus Code Veronica, and who is actually instrumental in driving those events forward. But more important than the plot in the game is the emotional journey of the two characters. Both Angela Santalbano as Grace and Nick Apostolides as Leon give fantastic performances, and Angela in particular is superb in portraying the fear and panic of someone thrust into a situation that they're totally unprepared for, as well as the grief and trauma that underpins where Grace is coming from. Nick, meanwhile, manages to portray just how far Leon has come with the vocal fry of the older character and a line delivery which in itself tells a story of his journey over 28 years. The writing also reflects strong themes of survivor's guilt, which manifests differently for each character, yet thematically ties both together in a way that elicits genuine emotion as their arcs develop. The main villain of the game is also surprisingly compelling, mostly in more subtle ways, such as how he behaves towards each character. His look has been compared to Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, but his mannerisms come off more akin to Hannibal Lecter, particularly in his interactions with Grace, and he is a long way off from the metaphorical mustache twirling of Wesker in RE5. He also doesn't feel underutilized or overshadowed by his subordinates, like Evelyn in relation to Jack Baker in RE7, or Mother Miranda in relation to Lady Dimitrescu in Village. Unfortunately, the side effect of this is the secondary villain in these endeavours, who I won't name or show here due to spoilers, does feel very much unnecessary in the grand scheme of things, especially as we never learn anything substantive about them, except by inference, and even if what we might guess is correct, it never fundamentally pays off in any significant way. The story's split focus between Grace and Leon is reflected in the campaign design, which here is somewhere between the episodic switching of the Revelations games and the A and B scenarios of RE2. What exactly this means is probably a spoiler, at least in terms of the story structure. So all I will say is that the way the game is set up gives you a similar amount of time with each character and their gameplay style, while still managing to support the flow of the narrative, meaning that it's paced fairly well as a result. There is a strong argument to be made that Grace and Leon's sections are different enough that Requiem feels like two different games. This is deliberate and feels like an attempt to marry both the survival horror and the action tendencies within the series and please fans of both. For me, the blend works overall, but as a survival horror fan since the game's origins in the 1990s, my preference is for Grace's sections. So we'll start there. One thing to mention quickly is that you can switch between first and third person for both characters at any point you want. Compared to the third person mode implemented for Village, which feels like a wider FOV first person mode with an avatar on screen, this is really well done and you can feel the differences. For example, in how Grace moves when sprinting in a panic in third person versus in first person. And while I did my first playthrough entirely in third person, as I generally prefer it, on subsequent runs I did switch on occasion where it felt advantageous to do so. Once you pass the prologue, which is primarily about setting up the plot through cutscenes interspersed with small, linear, interactive sections, we find ourselves in the private medical facility at Rhodes Hill. Just like so many other mansion-like environments throughout the series, most of the doors are locked, and we have to explore and solve puzzles in order to find what we need in order to reach our main objective, in this case escaping the centre. Whether in Resident Evil or other survival horror games, there are two things that make gameplay stand out with this basic formula. One is a really strong sense of place, the location having its own identity to the point that it's practically a character within the story itself. The other is how well the map design, location and enemy placements, and the mechanics we have to work with complement each other in order to create a compelling challenge. That sense of place is certainly there in Rhodes Hill, feeling at once luxurious and yet oppressive and unnaturally sterile. The tightness of the corridors, the obstacles that break up the larger spaces and force you to think through how and where you move, and the general sense that as massive as this place is, it's also a maze wherein you don't want to make a wrong turn. It's also distinct as an environment from the old mansion of RE1 or the museum turned police headquarters of RE2, so that we don't feel like we're retreading old ground. As you explore, you'll find doors that require key items to open, and of course those which are locked from the other side. And over time the environment will become more open with new routes and shortcuts allowing you to backtrack or avoid enemies. It's easy to do this in a way that in practice is more linear than it appears. But whilst available resources and enemy placements might make doing things in a certain order easier, it's far from mandatory, and Rhodes Hill is a great map for survival horror exploration. As you explore, you'll acquire a gun and you can both find and later craft bullets, but Grace's main resource in this game is stealth. All of the zombies within the map have their own patterns and habits, informed in a lot of cases by their personalities from when they were alive. And these can both make them a formidable barrier to get past and provide you with ways to do so. For example, the blind zombies who are overly sensitive to sound will charge at and indiscriminately attack the source of any noise you make, which can make it problematic to run or to break items to obtain resources. But you can also use that aversion to sound in order to make the blind zombie attack other zombies and kill them. There's an achievement for doing this, and a couple of areas where this is set up. But players have even found that the blind zombie can one-shot the toughest two enemies within the map. Another, simpler example is the zombie with an aversion to light, who can be lured away from blocking your path by turning on a light at the opposite end of the hallway, hiding, and then using the opportunity to sneak past. It's not possible to sneak to every single item that you want or need in the game, which does mean sometimes you have to risk running past or engaging in combat. Requiem brings back the breakable knife and defensive item mechanic from RE2 Remake, allowing you to resist damage when grabbed, or to attack enemies when they're knocked down. You can even use the bottles the game gives you as throwable distractions to stun enemies by throwing the bottle at them, pushing them over, and knifing them on the ground. But once Grace gets the ability to craft, as well as being able to make bullets, healing items, or ink ribbons, if you play on standard classic or higher, where there are a few autosaves in Grace's section, she can also do stealth kills using an item called a hemolytic injector, which makes the zombies explode. Crafting this and other items requires collecting infected blood, which can be found around the map and also harvested from downed zombies. And using lab equipment and solving a puzzle to analyze blood sample items you find in specific places will increase the number of items that you can craft. The result of this is that it's extremely beneficial to collect as much blood and crafting material as you can. Though the variety of items you can craft does mean you have to think carefully about how you use it, especially as, once the other supplies dry up, the main way to get more blood is by taking down zombies, and not through stealth kills, as this leaves no infected blood behind. However, killing zombies with bullets or knives does mean that as time passes, there is a risk the body will mutate and come back as a blister head. Like the Crimson Heads in RE1 Remake, these enemies are faster and more aggressive than those they mutated from. And the blister heads specifically move in a way that makes them harder to aim and shoot at, or to evade, the result being they're incredibly dangerous to have to deal with. Mechanics that make a return from RE7 in Grace's section are the use of antique coins to buy items, which can be useful early on in providing a boost for the player. Though there are only 4 items you can spend coins on, all in the same place, and you'll likely find more coins than you can actively spend without much effort. So there's not as much substance to this as there is in 7. More substantive are the return of steroids to increase your health and stabilizers to steady your aim, which you can craft as well as buy with coins, and are definitely a useful boost. On the whole, the puzzles that you have to solve in order to progress aren't particularly complex. There's the usual variety of fetch and carry puzzles for most key items, discovering combinations in notes or by deciphering clues, and in the case of the blood analysis puzzles, manipulating 3D objects. They're all generally engaging, but there's nothing on par with RE3's water sample puzzle or the chess piece puzzle in RE2 Remake that might tax your brain a little bit more. This is disappointing, but the general flow of the gameplay loop keeps everything engaging. One other disappointment is that there are no boss fights as Grace. There are 2 set pieces that bookend Grace's main portion where you have to deal with a large boss-like enemy through means other than direct combat, which is certainly cool, the latter being a callback to a classic RE game, which it would probably be a spoiler to name. But a classic survival horror boss fight where we have to engage in combat using our limited resources and movement rather than them all being handed over to the action hero Leon would have been fun, especially if it found ways to incorporate stealth or other mechanics such as hemolytic injectors. There are a couple of enemies in the main game who take far more bullets or multiple injectors to kill, which does highlight how cool this could have been in a specific boss battle setting. Ultimately, despite the lack of boss fights or more complex puzzles, Grace's part of Requiem is some of the best survival horror gameplay in the modern RE Engine era, and honestly, I would have been fine if Leon had been a supporting character and this had been the entirety of the gameplay. With that being said, Leon is a playable character within Requiem, and for about as much time as Grace is. Before I talk about Leon's gameplay in any depth, though, it's worth mentioning that there is something of a zapping system between the two, albeit short-lived and limited. After a specific set piece which leads Grace into a different area, Leon ends up in Rhodes Hill, where she has been. The item and enemy placement will be as Grace left it, and likewise, when Grace returns, she will find that any enemies Leon kills or items he takes are gone for her as well. Though extremely limited and not comparable to, say, the RE0 zapping system, this is cool to see. Going into depth about the mechanics requires showing gameplay from the second half of the game. While we won't be going into story beats, this may still count as a spoiler, so if you've not played the game already, then watch at your own risk. If you've played RE4 Remake, then the basics on how Leon works should be familiar. Although it's now a hatchet instead of a knife, parrying, melee to escape grabs, and stealth kills all make a comeback. This time, however, instead of having to pay the merchant to repair your knife or find disposable ones in the environment, Leon can restore the durability of the hatchet by sharpening it. Doing so takes a couple of seconds, and if it's lost all durability, then you cannot use any of its mechanics until you've done so, meaning that you have to take care of your weapon when in combat and be careful about leaving yourself exposed either by not doing so or by doing so at an inopportune moment. One thing to note, at least on console, is sharpening requires pressing both the parry and reload buttons together. This can be awkward, either giving you a moment where Leon stops moving as he's caught in the parry animation, or where the game doesn't register the input properly and reloads your equipped gun instead. Overall, this isn't a huge inconvenience, but could be when in an intense moment and trying to give yourself some space while sharpening. While we're on the subject of controls on console, another issue, which applies in general but is more noticeable as Leon, is that switching between walking and running can also be very awkward. There are options to set running or walking as your default, and choose whether to have to hold sprint or walk, or just be able to toggle. However, the button to switch is still L3, i.e. pressing in the left analog stick, which is my absolute least favourite way to sprint in games, because it's so easy to press it in accidentally. This goes double for Requiem, since R3, or pressing the right analog stick in, is crouch. Returning to Leon's combat, the hatchet adds a new mechanic in the form of executions. If you stun an enemy with head or leg shots, you can melee attack them with a kick, as in RE4 Remake, but if you stun them against a wall or get certain parries, then you can execute them with the hatchet either on the ground or on their knees. Leon's available arsenal is similar to previous games, with guns found through the course of your playthrough and also upgradable or replaceable for better versions through his item box. This follows on from the mid-game introduction of a mechanic where you earn points for kills, those points acting like a currency in much the same way as the money you would pick up from downed enemies in RE4 and 4 Remake. At the same time, flash grenades are gone from Leon's arsenal, and normal grenades seem weaker, being used more for stuns on blister heads than actual kills. This, alongside the streamlining of the health system down to green herbs, which you can combine, and med injectors, seems to be about simplifying certain mechanics to focus on other systems. This is neither good nor bad, but it is worth mentioning. As previously mentioned, my pedigree in Resident Evil has always been geared more towards survival horror than action. That said, I really liked 4 Remake's blend of action with horror and more exploration, and that carries over into Leon's main section in Requiem. The map here doesn't feel as inspired as Rhodes Hill, and unlike there, much of the exploration is optional rather than necessary. But after how linear his earlier interludes to Grace's gameplay were, it is still good to have more exploration built into the map. One thing I will say is that the post-apocalyptic colouring and texturing does make almost all the environments feel quite similar, but are perhaps the pitch black ruins of the subway being reminiscent of a similar environment in Leon's campaign from RE6. Speaking of RE6, the weakest, or most frustrating, parts of Leon's section are those where it leans too heavily into that game's vibe. But it's probably worth explaining what I mean by that, as that game's major fault isn't specifically the action focus, though it's not my preference, as I've already said, nor is it even that the action is over the top at times. It's that the action is chaotic, in a bad way, while trying to be a very different kind of game to what we expect from Resident Evil. As an example of what I mean, there's a part of Requiem as Leon where you discover zombies that were soldiers and still carry their machine guns, and shoot them. Enemies with guns were bad enough in RE6, when every couple of seconds they would hit you and send you collapsing to the floor in a multiple seconds long stun animation. Combine zombies with guns, zombies without guns, and zombies firing mortars, and that unique combination of being shot to death while parrying a zombie charge, or blasted by a mortar while hiding from gunfire, and the resulting sense of bedlam, which makes it all feel like a slog, and where damage is extra cheap, is the most perfect homage Requiem could pay to RE6, and I mean that in the most derogatory sense possible. A much later section with living soldiers is even worse, and genuinely felt like someone had taken away my Resident Evil game and forced me in front of exactly the kind of generic shooter game I would never actively choose to play. On a more positive note, Leon's section in particular plays into the nostalgia of the game and its revisiting of Raccoon City. Without going beyond what was in the marketing into spoilers, I will say that the gameplay side of this walks a fine line between homage and nostalgia bait. For me, it manages to stay on the right side of that line for the most part, but that is very subjective and you'll have to judge for yourself. Overall, despite the negatives I mentioned, I broadly enjoyed Leon's gameplay, but would still say that unlike Grace's, I'm not sure that it would stand up on its own if that was the whole of the gameplay loop. The other thing worth mentioning is the difficulty. I played my first playthrough on Standard Classic, which I believe is slightly harder than Standard Modern, not only because of the need to use ink ribbons to save as Grace, but also due to the toughness of the enemies, though I can't say that for certain. What I will say is that, as someone who's played survival horror games for 30 years, I felt perfectly comfortable playing on that difficulty. It could have been more challenging, but wasn't too easy, and was right in my sweet spot for a casual playthrough. The actual casual difficulty was fun for doing the speedrunning, no healing and no blood collection achievements. But while it certainly is much easier, you do still have to respect the basic mechanics of the game to progress. And on my no healing run, I was punished a couple of times for underestimating it and playing recklessly, which I liked. I played Insanity difficulty twice, once with and once without infinite ammo. The latter playthrough was more satisfying overall, as I was forced to engage with the gameplay properly again, which underlined that while there are some moments designed to catch you out or put you in a tough spot, on the whole the key to getting through is playing properly. As Grace, that meant fully utilising the crafting system, taking risks and saving strategically. As Leon, it meant mastering the stuns and parries and executions, which for the most part I managed quite well and enjoyed the challenge. One significant downside to the difficulty is that Grace doesn't really have any kind of equivalent to Leon in terms of combat mechanics, which marks out here one forced combat section as feeling as though it was only balanced for New Game Plus, as you're trying to survive enemies in a closed off area when without unlockable charms, you are likely to die in a single bite, and a full clip in one of the 2 pistols you can find in the map doesn't even stun them. As Leon, the downside is that those areas which already feel like a chaotic slog on lower difficulties only become more so on Insanity. On the whole, Resident Evil Requiem is an excellent game. It has its flaws, and I've discussed those which stood out to me, but it is still probably my favourite Resident Evil game of the modern era. It's a hugely ambitious game which tries to give something to fans of all types. And speaking personally, I think it succeeded for those of us who love exploration, resource management and tense moments that define survival horror. I also enjoyed a majority of the action gameplay, which is an achievement since RE 4, 5 and especially 6 do not have the replay value for me that the original trilogy and Code Veronica do. Most importantly, if Requiem is going to define the direction for future entries in the series, then the things that I hope the developers take from it are that there's still plenty to be done in the realm of survival horror, as the current indie renaissance also shows, and that Capcom absolutely should not treat Grace Ashcroft's gameplay as a requiem for the genre. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like. I put out new videos talking about horror stories and video games at least once a month, so consider subscribing to keep up to date and make sure you don't miss out. You can get early access to future videos on both this and my other channel by joining my Patreon for as little as £1 a month. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.